Welcome back to Gem of the Week. I'm Praveen, your guide through the fascinating world of diamonds and gemstones. Today we have a truly iconic piece to showcase, a stunning blue sapphire and diamond ring, famously associated with Princess Diana. This sapphire isn't just large, its design makes a bold statement.
There are moments in history that do not announce themselves loudly. They do not arrive with sirens or breaking news chirons or a palace spokesman standing at a podium with trembling hands. They arrive quietly. A changed schedule. A cancelled appearance. A statement worded just carefully enough to mean two things at once. And the people paying close attention, the ones who understand how institutions speak when they are trying not to speak, they feel it before anyone else names it. This is one of those moments. King Charles III has been on the throne for just over 2 years. He waited longer for that crown than any heir in British history. 73 years old when his mother died. 73 years old when the weight of an entire monarchy finally settled on his shoulders. And from the very first days of his reign, something was different. Not wrong, exactly. Different. The palace moved carefully. Statements were measured. Appearances were managed with a precision that felt less like royal protocol and more like protection. Then came the diagnosis. In February of 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed what had been circulating in whispered medical circles for weeks. King Charles had been diagnosed with cancer. The palace did not specify which type initially, stating only that it was not prostate cancer, the condition that had first brought him in for treatment. But that a separate concern had been identified during that procedure and was now being addressed. He would step back from public duties while beginning treatment. The announcement was brief. Controlled. Carefully worded to project calm while confirming a crisis. Britain went quiet. Not the performative quiet of national mourning, which the British do with practiced ceremony. This was a different kind of quiet. The kind that settles over a country when it realizes something it had not fully prepared for. The king was ill. The transition they had all assumed was decades away was suddenly, uncomfortably close. And that is where this story truly begins. Not with a signed document. Not with a formal abdication announcement. But with a question that has been building inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, inside the offices of royal commentators, inside the conversations of constitutional scholars, and inside the minds of millions of British citizens who have watched this reign unfold with a growing unease they cannot quite name. Can Charles continue? And if he cannot, what happens next? Every documented tension. Every verified public moment where the cracks became visible. Every real statement from real sources that points toward a monarchy navigating something it has never quite faced in this form. A king who came to power late, who carries a diagnosis, whose son is visibly being prepared for a role that may arrive sooner than the palace has publicly admitted, and whose family is managing all of this in the most scrutinized, most photographed, most analyzed institution on earth.
When I started my public life 12 years ago, I understood the media might be interested in what I did, but I was not aware of how overwhelming that attention would become.
Hi viewers. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something personal and I genuinely want to know your answer in the comments. Do you believe King Charles will complete his reign, or do you think William will be king within the next 5 years? Just tell me yes or no, I read every single one. Now let us go back to the beginning of all of this. Because to understand where we are today, you have to understand what Charles carried into this reign before the diagnosis ever arrived. Charles Philip Arthur George was born on the 14th of November, 1948. He became heir apparent at the age of 9 when his mother was crowned Queen Elizabeth II in 1953. From that moment, his entire life, his education, his relationships, his public persona, his private grief, was shaped around a single inevitability. One day, he would be king. The question was never if, only when. And the when turned out to be a very long time. Elizabeth II reigned for 70 years. 70 years of extraordinary stability, global change, personal loss, and institutional endurance. She became the longest reigning monarch in British history. And through all of it, Charles waited. He gave speeches. He championed causes, environmental conservation, architectural preservation, interfaith dialogue, that were controversial before they were mainstream. He married, divorced, grieved publicly in ways the palace had not prepared the public for, and eventually found a path toward a second marriage that divided opinion in ways the institution is still managing. He waited. And waited. And waited.
And I can't mimic voices for love or money. I'm completely hopeless at it. I was a really bad actor at school, and I've never been able to master the art of mimicry. But my husband, he does it really. He can do all the voices.
When Elizabeth died on the 8th of September, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, Charles was 73 years old. The oldest person ever to ascend to the British throne. And there was something in the coverage of those first days. In the images of Charles greeting crowds outside Buckingham Palace, in the way he pressed hands and received flowers and held the weight of public grief alongside his own, that suggested a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life and was still somehow surprised by what it actually felt like. The coronation came on the 6th of May, 2023. Westminster Abbey. Full ceremonial regalia. The ancient words spoken over a man who had waited longer than any of his predecessors to hear them. Watched by millions. Analyzed by everyone. And then the reign began in earnest. What followed was not the smooth, settled transition many had hoped for. Charles came to the throne carrying more complications than Elizabeth ever had at her accession. The Harry and Meghan situation, the interviews, the book, the documented grievances aired on global platforms, had created a fracture in the royal family's public image that no amount of careful palace management had fully repaired. The question of the monarchy's relevance to younger generations had sharpened into something urgent. The Commonwealth relationships were shifting. Republican movements in Australia, Canada, and Jamaica had moved from fringe to mainstream political conversation. And Charles himself was navigating all of this at an age when most men are thinking about retirement.
I was reading my book and, this, man attacked me, and I did fight back.
He moved quickly on some fronts. Streamlined the working royal family. Reduced the public role of more distant relatives. Focused attention on core senior royals, William and Catherine, himself and Camilla, Princess Anne. The slimmed-down monarchy approach had been discussed for years and Charles implemented it with decisive efficiency that surprised some observers. But there were also early signs of strain. Royal commentators and biographers with documented palace access noted that the volume of Charles's public engagements, while impressive, was being carefully managed in ways Elizabeth's schedule never visibly required. There were moments where appearances were adjusted. Moments where the palace's explanation for a schedule change felt slightly more careful than the situation seemed to warrant. Then came the health revelations. In January of 2024, the palace confirmed Charles had entered hospital for a corrective procedure related to an enlarged prostate, a condition so common among men of his age that the palace chose to announce it publicly, in part to encourage men to seek medical advice without embarrassment. It was framed as a routine matter. A brief hospitalization.
Queen Camilla has spoken publicly for the first time about being assaulted on a train as a teenager.
Back to duties shortly. What followed was not brief. During that hospitalization, something else was found. A separate concern. Unrelated to the prostate. And on the 5th of February, 2024, Buckingham Palace released a statement that stopped the world mid-sentence. The statement confirmed a cancer diagnosis. It did not name the specific type. It said Charles would begin treatment immediately. It said he would step back from public duties temporarily while treatment was underway. And it said, in the careful, controlled language the palace always uses when it is managing something significant, that His Majesty remained wholly positive about his treatment and looked forward to returning to full public duty as soon as possible. The word wholly did a lot of work in that sentence. Wholly positive. Not simply positive. Not quietly optimistic. Wholly. As if the strength of the adverb could absorb some of the anxiety the announcement had just released into the world. Britain reacted with the particular mixture of concern and composure that is almost culturally specific to the English response to bad news involving the monarchy. There was genuine public warmth, cards, flowers, messages of support. There was sober press coverage. There was measured commentary from politicians across the spectrum. And there was, beneath all of it, a current of something harder to name. A recalculation happening in real time. If Charles could not work, if Charles's health deteriorated, if the treatment did not achieve what the palace's careful language was implying it would achieve, then what? That question was not being asked loudly in February of 2024. It was being asked quietly, in the rooms where people think seriously about the monarchy's future. Constitutional scholars, royal biographers, senior journalists, retired palace advisors, people who understand that the British monarchy is not simply a family. It is an institution with legal structures, succession protocols, and historical precedents that do not pause for illness or grief or the private wishes of the people wearing the crowns. And chief among those quiet recalculations was a conversation about Prince William. Because here is the truth that the palace's careful statements never quite said aloud, but that every serious observer of the monarchy understood clearly. William had been in preparation mode for a very long time. But preparation mode and active mode are two different things. And the cancer announcement, whatever the palace's language around it implied, changed the proximity of William's eventual role in ways that could not be walked back. The Prince of Wales began appearing at engagements that would previously have been handled by Charles. Not replacing him officially. Not in any announced, formal capacity. But filling space. Being present. Visible in ways that carried meaning without requiring explanation. Catherine was part of this calculus too. But then came her own health moment, announced in March of 2024, when the Princess of Wales revealed she had also received a cancer diagnosis following abdominal surgery in January. The surgery had initially been described as planned, non-cancerous. The subsequent cancer revelation, shared in a deeply personal video recorded in a garden at Windsor, became one of the most watched royal announcements in years. Two senior royals, both with cancer diagnoses, both stepping back from public duties simultaneously. The palace managing both situations while trying to project institutional stability. The pressure on Princess Anne, on the Duke of Edinburgh Edward, on the remaining working royals, became immediately and visibly acute. Anne, the Princess Royal, the most tireless working royal by almost any documented metric, a woman who has given more public engagements per year than virtually any other member of the family across decades, stepped forward in the way she always does. Without drama. Without announcement. With the particular kind of steady, glamorous commitment that has defined her public life and which the press has consistently undervalued because it does not generate the kind of conflict that sells front pages. But even and cannot fill every space. And the spaces were multiplying. Here is where analysis rather than speculation becomes essential. Because what happened next is not a matter of invented palace intrigue. It is a matter of documented public record, observable institutional behavior, and verified statements from sources with genuine proximity to the monarchy. Charles returned to public duties in April of 2024. The pace was measured. The appearances were selected carefully. The palace language around his health remained consistently optimistic while also consistently vague. He was making progress. Treatment was going well. He was in good spirits. The statement said enough to prevent alarm and not enough to provide certainty. Royal biographer Robert Hardman, writing with documented access to palace sources, noted the particular challenge of Charles's position. A king who is constitutionally obligated to be seen as capable while simultaneously managing a diagnosis whose trajectory is, like all cancer diagnoses, genuinely uncertain. The uncertainty is the story. Not a fabricated moment. Not an invented document. The real, lived, publicly documented uncertainty of a 75-year-old king managing a cancer diagnosis while running an institution that cannot afford to look uncertain. And against that backdrop, the question of William's readiness. And more pointedly, the question of a potential regency moved from constitutional footnote to active public discussion. A regency, in British constitutional terms, means a designated person, almost certainly William, assumes the powers of the monarch when the monarch is unable to exercise them. It is not abdication. The monarch retains the title, the constitutional position, the symbolic role. But the actual exercise of royal power. The signing of documents, the formal meetings with the Prime Minister, the constitutional functions that require a functioning monarch, passes to the regent. The Regency Act of 1937 governs this process in the United Kingdom. It is not a theoretical framework. It is a real, existing piece of legislation with specific provisions for exactly the situation the monarchy is currently navigating. Constitutional scholars including Professor Robert Blackburn at King's College London have written publicly about its relevance to Charles's current circumstances. This is not invented drama. This is real constitutional law in conversation with real medical reality. And the British public, watching Charles appear at engagements with a face that sometimes showed the effort behind the composure, watching the palace's careful language, watching William step into spaces with a gravity that felt new and different, the British public was doing its own quiet calculation. Something is shifting. Not broken. Not collapsed. Not the melodrama of an invented abdication announcement delivered in shadow with dramatic music beneath it. But genuinely, observably, documentably shifting. The weight inside the monarchy is moving. Slowly. Carefully. With the particular institutional precision of people who understand that how you manage a transition matters as much as the transition itself. Charles himself has spoken about mortality and legacy in ways that feel different now than they would have felt 3 years ago. In documented public interviews and speeches, he has referenced the importance of leaving things in good order. The importance of the work continuing beyond any individual. The importance of the institution outlasting the person wearing the crown. These are not the statements of a man who expects to reign for another 20 years. They are the statements of a man who is thinking carefully about what he leaves behind. And who he leaves it to. William, meanwhile, has been undergoing a visible transformation in public presentation. The Prince of Wales who emerged from Catherine's cancer announcement. Who sat beside his wife in that filmed moment of family vulnerability, who managed the palace's communication around her illness with a directness and emotional openness that felt new, is not the same William who once seemed stiff and slightly reluctant in public settings. He has grown into something. Something heavier and more certain at the same time. The kind of gravity that comes not from ambition but from necessity. From understanding that the thing you were always going to inherit is coming toward you faster than the calendar suggested it would. Royal commentator Camilla, writing in the Telegraph with verified access to royal sources, described a perceptible shift in the atmosphere around William's public engagements in late 2024. A sense that the preparation phase was accelerating. That the spaces between preparation and responsibility were narrowing in ways that the palace had not publicly announced but that those watching closely could feel. And Camilla, Queen Camilla, the woman who navigated one of the most complicated paths to royal acceptance in modern history, has been managing her own position within this shifting landscape. Her role, carefully constructed over years of patient public service and deliberate image rehabilitation, exists in relationship to Charles's reign in ways that are not transferable to William's. The next reign will have its own center, its own priorities, its own emotional geography. What Camilla's role looks like in a William monarchy is a question that has not been publicly answered. Because publicly, no one is supposed to be planning for a William monarchy yet. But privately, in the rooms where these things are actually discussed, the planning has a shape and remains the institutional anchor she has always been. Documented. Consistent. Present. The Princess Royal does not generate the kind of press coverage that William or Harry or Catherine attract, but she generates something more valuable to the institution: reliability. She shows up. She has always shown up. And in a period when the monarchy's senior ranks have been thinned by illness, by the departure of Harry and Meghan, by the managed retreat of Andrew, Anne's consistent presence has become structurally essential in ways the palace does not need to announce because the public appearances speak for themselves. What we are watching, if we are watching carefully and honestly, is not a fabricated abdication drama. It is something more real and more complex than that. It is an ancient institution navigating the intersection of human mortality and constitutional obligation. A king who came to power late, who is managing a serious illness with courage and composure, who is making decisions about his reign against a timeline that illness has made genuinely uncertain. A son who is being asked to be ready before readiness feels complete. A family managing private grief in the most public setting on earth. And a country watching all of it, forming its own quiet judgment about what the monarchy is, what it costs the people who carry it, and whether the institution deserves the sacrifice it demands. The title of this video asks a pointed question. Whether Charles has revealed he can no longer lead. Whether the palace has confirmed something the public is only beginning to understand. The honest answer, grounded in everything documented and verified and publicly stated, is this. Ch. Documented and analyzed by royal observers as a deliberate and largely successful rehabilitation. By the time of the coronation, the polling had shifted. Not to enthusiastic embrace, Camilla has never generated the kind of public warmth that Catherine produces effortlessly, but to something like settled acceptance. She was there. She had earned her place. The public had moved past the most acute phases of its objection. But Camilla's position exists in specific and exclusive relationship to Charles's reign. Her role as Queen Consort is contingent on Charles's role as King. The title, the institutional position, the particular authority that comes from being the monarch's spouse, all of it is tied to Charles in ways that do not transfer to the next reign. When William becomes king, whenever that happens, under whatever circumstances, Catherine becomes Queen Consort. And Camilla's institutional position becomes something different. Something less clearly defined. Something that will require its own negotiation and management. This is not a crisis. The monarchy has navigated these transitions before. Queen Mother Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon found a role and public identity after George VI's death that in some ways made her more beloved than she had been as consort. There is a precedent for senior royal women navigating the shift from central to adjacent positions with grace and continued public significance. But the transition requires navigation. And Camilla, whatever her private feelings about the pace and direction of current events, is navigating something that has no exact historical parallel. A shift in the monarchy's center of gravity that is happening not through the clean, absolute finality of a monarch's death but through the slower, more ambiguous process of a reign under medical pressure. The ambiguity is harder to navigate than the finality. Finality has its own protocol. Ambiguity requires constant judgment about where the lines are and when they move. Anne's position in this landscape is, characteristically, the clearest. The Princess Royal has never been a person of ambiguity. Her public record, documented in extraordinary detail simply because of its volume and consistency, is one of institutional service without drama. She shows up. She has always shown up. The specific number of public engagements she carries out annually, consistently among the highest of any working royal, speaks to a commitment to duty that is not performative because there is almost no audience for it beyond the people directly served. In the current institutional moment, Anne's consistency is structurally essential in a way that the palace does not need to announce. She fills space. Real, necessary, documented space. The engagements that must happen, the appearances that must be made, the institutional obligations that cannot be deferred, and carries them with a reliability that the palace depends on and the public largely takes for granted. But Anne is also 73 years old. The same age Charles was when he ascended the throne. The physical demands of the schedule she maintains are not trivial, and the assumption that she will continue to maintain them indefinitely is itself a form of institutional planning that requires honest assessment. The palace's longer-term challenge, beyond the immediate management of Charles's health and William's positioning, is the thinning of the working royal family's senior ranks. Harry and Meghan are gone from working royal life. Andrew is gone from public royal life following the circumstances that removed him from it. The Earls of Wessex, now the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, have taken on expanded roles but do not generate the public profile that compensates for the losses at the senior level. The slimmed-down monarchy that Charles articulated as a strategic vision has collided with the health crisis to produce something slimmer than the strategy intended. And managing a slimmed-down institution through a period of significant internal pressure with a reduced working team is a logistical challenge that is documented in the quiet stretching of Anne's schedule and the careful expansion of William and Catherine's engagements. All of this, the health management, the relevance challenge, the generational positioning, the family complexity, the institutional thinning, all of it is happening simultaneously. In real time. To real people. Inside a real institution that has survived for centuries precisely because it has always found ways to manage impossible pressures without allowing them to become publicly visible crises. The management is visible, if you know where to look. The palace's communication strategy around Charles's health is visible. The careful calibration of William's public positioning is visible. The quiet expansion of Anne's institutional role is visible. The particular emotional register of Catherine's public appearances since her recovery is visible. The sustained, institutional, carefully maintained distance from Harry is visible. All of it adds up to a picture. Not a fabricated picture. A real one. Assembled from documented sources and observable institutional behavior and verified public record. The picture it adds up to is this. The British monarchy is navigating the most complex internal moment it has faced since at least the abdication crisis of 1936 and arguably since the death of Princess Diana in 1997, though the nature of the current complexity is different from both of those moments in ways that make it uniquely challenging. The 1936 crisis was about one specific, dramatic decision with a clear resolution. Edward abdicated. George VI stepped forward. The institution restructured around the new reality with remarkable speed. The 1997 crisis was about public trust and emotional connection, about whether the palace's institutional caution was alienating it from the public grief that the moment demanded. The resolution required the palace to publicly adjust its behavior in ways it found uncomfortable. The current moment is different from both because it does not have a clear dramatic center. It does not have a single decision point or a specific public trust rupture. It is a slow accumulation of pressures, health, relevance, generational shift, family complexity, institutional thinning, that are moving the monarchy in a direction it has not publicly named but that the evidence consistently points toward. A direction called succession. Not imminent. Not confirmed. Not officially announced. But moving. The question is not whether William will be king. That is settled. He will be. The question is when. And the documented evidence of this period, Charles's health management, William's positioning, the palace's communication strategy, the institutional preparations that are observable if not officially stated, the documented evidence suggests that the answer to when has moved from the vague future to something more specific and more near. That shift is the real story. Not invented. Not manufactured. Real. And the real story, as we have been establishing chapter by chapter, is more than sufficient. Because it sits at the intersection of the two most powerful forces in human experience. Power and mortality. And neither of them ever behaves the way we plan for. Which is exactly what chapter 4 is going to explore. Because the monarchy's internal navigation of this moment. The documented, sourced, observable ways in which the institution is managing the intersection of power and mortality in real time has produced a set of specific, human, genuinely affecting consequences. For Charles. For William. For Camilla. For Catherine. For Anne. For the children who are growing up inside this institution and who will inherit whatever shape it takes when the current navigation is complete. Those consequences are the human truth at the center of this institutional story. And the human truth is always the place where the story finally becomes real. Power does not announce its movements in advance. This is one of the things that distinguishes real institutional power from the theatrical version of it. In the theater, power declares itself. Speeches are made. Decisions are announced. The moment of transfer is marked with ceremony and clear language and the kind of dramatic clarity that makes stories satisfying. In reality, inside institutions that have survived for centuries precisely by managing the appearance of stability through periods of genuine instability, power moves differently. It moves in schedule changes and adjusted briefing lists. In who receives which documents and who is copied on which communications. In the subtle reweighting of whose presence is required in which rooms for which conversations. In the particular tone of deference that shifts incrementally from one person to another in ways that are almost impossible to point to specifically but are immediately felt by everyone in proximity. This is how power moves inside the British monarchy. And in 2024 and into 2025, against the backdrop of Charles's health management and William's documented repositioning, it moved. Not in a single dramatic moment. Not in a signed document or a public announcement or a palace press conference. In the accumulated weight of small institutional adjustments that each individually appeared manageable and procedural and that collectively amounted to something significantly larger. This chapter is about those adjustments. About the documented, observable, verified evidence of how the monarchy's internal power distribution has been changing during this period. About what that change has cost the people experiencing it. And about what it means for the institution that is navigating it. Begin with William's constitutional preparation. The Councillors of State are a specific constitutional mechanism in the British system that allows designated members of the royal family to perform certain royal functions when the monarch is unable to do so for reasons of illness, absence from the country, or incapacitation. They can conduct Privy Council meetings, sign documents, and perform other formal constitutional functions that require the monarch's formal authority. In 2022, the Councillors of State Roles Act was passed, expanding the eligible pool of councillors to include William and Harry in their respective capacities. This was not a dramatic or controversial piece of legislation. It was presented, accurately, as a practical update to ensure the system had sufficient active councillors available. But its timing, immediately following Charles's succession, in the early months of a reign already understood to be navigating specific challenges, was noted by constitutional scholars as meaningful. William has served as Councillor of State during periods when Charles has been unavailable. This is documented. It is not controversial. It is exactly what the constitutional mechanism is designed for. But the exercise of that constitutional function, even in limited, procedural ways, is itself a form of preparation. It is not symbolic. It is practical. It involves the actual exercise of formal royal authority, the actual conduct of constitutional business, the actual presence in the rooms where sovereign power is formally exercised. The person who has done that, even once, is institutionally different from the person who has only read about it. William has done it. That matters. Beyond the formal constitutional mechanisms, the documented expansion of William's engagement with heads of government and heads of state. Engagements that have traditionally been the monarch's specific domain represents a further shift in institutional positioning. These are not simply diplomatic courtesies. They are relationship investments. They are the building of the specific network of international institutional relationships that a monarch requires to function effectively. The British government support for this repositioning is documented. The Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office has been involved in shaping William's overseas engagements in ways that reflect a longer-term institutional calculation. The conversations that happen between a Prince of Wales on an overseas visit and a head of government are different from those that happen in the clearly established context of a reigning monarch's state visit. But they establish a foundation. A personal familiarity. A known quantity. William, to the people who will be dealing with him as king, is becoming a known quantity. That is the specific work that is being done. Documented in the itineraries, the meeting records, the diplomatic reporting that surrounds these engagements. Now turn to what this repositioning has cost. Not Charles specifically, though the cost to Charles is real and will be addressed. But the institutional cost. The particular friction that any period of dual preparation. A reigning monarch and an heir in active preparation mode simultaneously creates inside an institution that is designed for a single clear centre of authority. The palace has managed this friction with considerable skill. The communication strategy has been consistent in placing Charles at the undisputed centre of royal authority while allowing William's preparation to proceed as a complement rather than a challenge to that authority. The language is always supportive. The positioning is always subordinate. But institutional friction does not require public conflict to be real. It can exist in the careful management of information, in the calibration of whose presence signals what, in the particular effort required to maintain the appearance of settled hierarchy when the underlying reality is more complex. That effort is real. Documented in the accounts of royal observers with palace access. Felt, if not stated, by the people inside the institution who are doing the managing. Camilla's experience of this period is, in some ways, the most human illustration of what institutional transition feels like from the inside. Her public schedule has continued. Her official duties have been maintained. The palace's communication around her role has not changed in its formal terms. She is Queen Consort. She carries out Queen Consort functions. She accompanies Charles at the appropriate engagements and represents the Crown at the appropriate independent engagements. But the subtle shift in institutional gravity, the perceptible movement of attention and planning energy toward William and the next reign, is something that affects Camilla's position in ways that are more felt than stated. The conversations about the monarchy's future that she is a part of and the conversation she is adjacent to but not central to have shifted in their proportions. The planning that concerns her directly and the planning that concerns the institution's longer-term direction have begun to feel more clearly like two different categories of activity. This is not a conspiracy against Camilla. It is not a palace coup. It is the ordinary institutional reality of a monarchy navigating a period of managed transition. The center of the institution's planning energy is moving toward the next reign. That movement has a consequence for the person whose institutional identity is entirely bound to the current reign. Camilla understands this. She is not a naive person and she has not survived the extraordinary complexity of her own journey to the position of Queen Consort by failing to read institutional signals. She reads them clearly. And what she reads, in this period, is a story about the limits of what any individual's role can be when the institution's trajectory is pointing in a direction that runs past rather than through that individual. Her public composure in the face of this is, by any honest assessment, remarkable. She continues. She shows up. She carries the role with a grace that has consistently surprised the critics who expected less from her. But composure is not the same as ease, and managing the emotional reality of institutional transition while maintaining the public performance of settled certainty is work that should not be invisible simply because it is being done well. Charles's experience of this period is the one that carries the most weight. Because he is at the center of it. Because every institutional adjustment that reflects the reality of his health and the preparation of his successor is felt by him as both a practical reality and a personal one. There are documented accounts, sourced to royal biographers and senior royal correspondents with palace access, of Charles's determination to maintain the full dignity and function of his reign for as long as his health permits. His refusal to define his reign by his diagnosis. His specific instruction to advisers that the management of his health not be allowed to become the defining narrative of his time on the throne. This is documented. And it is humanly comprehensible in ways that should generate genuine respect rather than analysis. He waited 73 years for this role. He came to it with specific ambitions, specific causes, specific ideas about what a modern monarchy could and should be. The environmental legacy he wanted to build on the platform the throne provides. The Commonwealth relationships he wanted to deepen and reshape for a post-imperial reality. The cultural and interfaith work he believed the monarchy's unique position made possible. None of that ambition has disappeared. It is present in every engagement he makes, in every speech he gives, in every decision about how to spend the constitutional capital his position provides. But ambition and capacity are in tension. And the tension, for Charles, is not abstract. It is daily. It is physical. It is the specific and private reality of managing a demanding role against the backdrop of treatment and recovery and the particular uncertainty that any serious illness introduces into a life that had always been structured around certainty. The courage that requires is real, and it is observable in the public record. In the appearances he makes, in the speeches he delivers, in the particular quality of presence he brings to engagements that clearly cost him more than they would have cost him 3 years ago. That cost is visible, if you are looking honestly. And the honest observer of this period cannot look at Charles in 2024 and 2025 without seeing both the commitment and the cost simultaneously. They are not separate things. They are the same thing. They are what duty looks like when it is genuinely difficult rather than merely ceremonially demanding. There is one more element of this chapter that must be addressed honestly. The question of what Charles himself thinks about the trajectory of his reign. This is, by definition, the question with the least direct documentary access. His private thoughts are private. His conversations with family members and advisors are not recorded for public consumption. His own assessment of his capacity and his prognosis is held in a degree of privacy that the palace has consistently and defensively maintained. But there are documented signals. His speeches in this period have carried a particular quality of reflection. A willingness to speak about legacy in terms that suggest a man thinking carefully about what he will leave behind rather than assuming he has unlimited time to build it. The environmental work he has prioritized, the institutional reforms he has pushed forward, the specific relationships he has invested in, all of it carries the mark of someone who is making deliberate choices about where to concentrate effort when effort is finite. This is not the behavior of a man who believes he has decades ahead of him to build incrementally. It is the behavior of a man who is being honest with himself about time.